Welcome to the Inclusive Heroes Podcast with your host, Miguel Joey Aviles. Buckle up as we highlight and celebrate leaders who make inclusion happen in their world of work. If you're an HR leader, a DEI practitioner, an ERG champion, recruiter, or ally, this podcast shares the stories of how leaders raise awareness, cultivate courage, and achieve organizational transformation. Join us as we go behind the scenes of true inclusion and belonging. This is the Inclusive Heroes Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Inclusive Heroes Podcast. Today, we have a treat for you because we have Miss Sonia Aranza. Please, let me introduce her, and then we will get started with an amazing conversation. Sonia Aranza is a 25-year veteran in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her clients include giants such as Boeing, the CIA, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and many more. She is on the faculty of Howard University's Executive Diversity Program. Sonia was honored Outstanding Woman of the Year by the National Association of Professional Asian American Women and honored 100 most influential Filipina Americans in the United States. It's so relevant that we have Sonia as our guest as we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Sonia, welcome to the Inclusive Heroes Podcast. How are you doing today?
Hello, dear friend. What a joy. The treat is mine to be with you and your amazing community. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, Sonia. Let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
My friend, my story does not begin with me. I bring my ancestors with me. I am the youngest of two children, born to two incredible human beings. My mother was born in a culture and in a generation where it was insisted that women be married, that women rely on men to make a life. And my mother refused to do that. She defied that. So what she really wanted to do is to be educated. So in spite of the disruption of a war, in spite of the pressure of culture to be married, she pursued a college education. She persevered and created this dream for herself. My father, very interesting, amazing human being as well. What we know is that he was orphaned at a very, very early age. And he did not allow poverty to dictate his destiny. My father created his own luck. He approached a very wealthy family and asked them to take him in as a servant. And in return, they sent him to school. So these are my parents. This is part of the epic that I come from. They were defiant, they persevered, they were very, very determined. And, when I was 8 years old, in the Philippines where I was born, there was this big announcement that we were coming to America. So if you can just imagine, my friend and your dear community, here I am, 8 years old, and it was announced we're going to America. And that sudden change resulted because it was election time. My parents were both educators. They used the schools as polling places. And there was a political thug who tried to force my father to stuff a ballot box. And my father refused. My father refused. So this political thug put a gun to his head. And all of a sudden, we were coming to America. I grew up in the beautiful state of Hawaii. And then from Hawaii, I moved to Washington, D.C. 30 years ago. And the way I was called to do this work, diversity, equity, inclusion, I really believe it was divine intervention. I came into this space when it was not even called diversity, equity, inclusion. I was called to this work by means of landmark cases. In other words, people were getting sued. So it was called affirmative action, equal employment opportunity. And I worked on these huge landmark cases where by consent decree, they had to do this work. And I actually grew up in this practice because I saw it evolve from affirmative action, equal employment opportunity into the discovery that there are treasures in diversity. So then it became called diversity. And then there was another discovery. And the discovery was that you cannot really avail of the gifts until you actually become inclusive. So that's why it then evolved to something called diversity and inclusion. And then we discovered again that there were some things that were baked in that were inequitable. So it moved from diversity inclusion, to diversity, equity, inclusion, to now JEDI, as you know, my friend,
Yes.
EIEIO. We call it so many things, but the aspiration is to always continue to evolve the work. And I am privileged to be doing this work for a very long time.
My friend, thank you so much for giving us that perspective and honoring your parents. You're amazing. You're amazing parents. I wish I had the opportunity to meet them, because as I hear your powerful stories, that is always connected of who we are and why we do what we do. Sonia, thank you also for walking our audience to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been around for a while. This has been a journey. And that's what I want to talk about. You are a veteran. I'm in the field for over 25 years. What has sustained your passion despite the fatigue that seems to affect many DEI practitioners? And I hear about this fatigue, about this burnout. In fact, I not only hear about it, there was a moment in my career where I experienced that fatigue, and it is real. Can you tell us what sustained your passion?
Great question. Yes. Resilience and renewal, resilience and renewal, it has to be part of the practice, because when we're doing this work, it can be very depleting, and it's really a source of a lot of triggers. So resilience and renewal has to be a part of our practice. We pay a lot of attention on our physical health.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have conversations all the time about our physical health because we rely so much on our energy. However, just as important, or I would even assert even more important than the physical body, is our emotional body. our emotional body is so critical. And to make sure we have a healthy emotional body, we have to do what I call the inner work.
Mhm.
The inner work. From the time of our birth to this very moment, we've adopted so many beliefs. And at any time, these things can be triggered. And so when we're doing this work, we really cannot be hooked or triggered, or at least, we need to be able to uh, put a pause on those triggers. So renewal and resilience is so critical. It's a daily practice. For some, it includes mindfulness. For some, it's about being present with nature. For some, it's really about finding a way to sustain the sense of self, that centering of self. Just a moment ago, I went to plug my computer because I forgot that the computer is running on battery. Well, the same is true with us.
Yes.
We need to be able to plug in to a source that's greater than ourselves, to a power that can sustain us. And for some, it's their faith. For
Mhm.
some, it's being present, being mindful. But resilience and renewal requires inner work. And that is really what has sustained me for a quarter of a century. And I always tell people it is what will sustain you too.
I love that. Some of us, Sonia, are afraid of that inner work because that inner work will give us access sometimes to places that we have not been before and to
Mhm.
parts of ourselves that sometimes we are afraid because triggers get those parts of us that sometimes we're afraid of excited or volatile or awakened. We can use many words. So, Sonia, I would love for you to give access to a glimpse of what your day looks like. How do you make sure that you do your inner work in a daily basis? Can you just tell us what are some of those daily practices that you believe can continuously reinvigorate our souls and allow us to show up as powerful as ever?
Beautiful, beautiful question. Yes. So when I awake, before my feet even touches the floor, while I am still laying in my bed, you know, I recite to myself this these amazing thoughts from the Dalai Lama, and he says, every day, think as you awake. I am alive. I have a precious human life, and I will not put it to waste. So one of my immediate practice is to do that while I'm still lying in bed, before my feet touches the floor. And then part of my morning routine is I do meditation. So, meditation is so interesting because there are so many associations people have with it. And for me, it's really about being present to my breath, being present to life, being present to the sounds around me. It's springtime. Sometimes I hear birds. It's really about mindfulness. And this is so critical because then I take that into my work. So, for example, when I am with clients, right, and you are easily triggered, or there's something that say that can easily hook you, I go back to the breath, I go back to the mindfulness, I remind myself I am fine, all is well. So, those two quick things. And then a bigger answer is I, you know, for many people, they do walks. in nature, for me, it's yoga. So
Mhm.
I have been practicing yoga for a very long time. And for me, you know, yoga is really about mindfulness, and it's really about paying attention to myself. So if I can give you a quick example of
Yes.
that.
Yes.
So, for example, in my yoga practice, I practice hot yoga. It's so easy for me to go into that hot room and say, "Oh, it's too hot. What the hell am I doing here? I need water." And it's like when I enter a corporation. It's like when I
Yes.
enter a client space and it's toxic, and you say, well, what am I doing here? I need to get out of here. Am I going to be able to handle this? And just like in the yoga room, I just take a deep breath and I remind myself, all is well, all is well. And so when I'm with my clients and those moments, of fear come, I remind myself, all is well. So these are just examples of some of my practices.
I love that, Sonia. And it's so powerful because that those inner practices and those behaviors that we have behind closed doors, things that we do to prepare ourselves, show up in our day-to-day interactions. So when we
Mm.
are healthy DEI practitioners, and healthy in the sense physical, mentally, and spiritually, we can show up and even be more effective as DEI practitioners. So, Sonia, thank you so much for joining the podcast to celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so you thank you for honoring us. Thank you for honoring our audience. And as an Asian American in the DEI field, why do you believe it's important for corporate and organizational leaders to celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month? And what can they do to authentically celebrate, honor your careers, your perspectives, your accomplishments, your whole being?
Mm, Great question. Thank you, my friend, for that question. You know, companies, organizations are a microcosm of society. So, what's happening in society, what we observe in society, such as bias, xenophobia, racism, it shows up in the workplace. So, what's going on in society enters the workplace, maybe in more subtle ways, but they are manifested. So, when we celebrate things like Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, it's really an opportunity to educate, to learn, and to dismantle some of the ignorances that we see in society, right? So when we take the time, not just to celebrate, but to educate, we really expand our understanding of one another. And so these are not just mere events, they're really precious opportunities to educate one another, which then contributes to understanding. When we take a look at bias, xenophobia, racism, they can only survive, you know, in the cave of ignorance. So in the workplace, we don't want ignorance, right? And so we really want to advance our understanding of one another. So to authentically do this, to authentically honor, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, I really encourage leaders with all due respect to go beyond the food and the music which we love, right? And to really dig deep into the history. Where did xenophobia come from? What's the historical backdrop of this? How is this inextricably linked to anti-Blackness in this country? What is the history here? Who makes up Asian Pacific American Pacific Islanders? What's the difference between a Filipino and a Korean? What's the geographic historical context of their background? So we have to dig deep. And I would even encourage companies and corporations to create a space, create platforms, opportunities for your own employees to share their story. It's so critical to share our stories because each and every one is so unique. We all come from an epic. And as we learn to listen to each other's story, we learn to see each other as human beings, as members of the human family, with hopes, wishes, and dreams like everyone else.
And Sonia, as DEI practitioners, we are called to dig deeper, to constantly dig deeper. And our job is challenging systems and opening doors to historically excluded talent. And your call to leaders is take advantage of this Heritage Month to dig deeper and to authentically do so by showing you care. So, what other steps can leaders take to dismantle systems that have served historically as barriers to excluded groups?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, there are really two fronts that we need to address. So we talk about, the individual bias, and then there's the institutional bias, as you just brought up. And it's important to remind ourselves that both feed off one another, right? So individual bias, when we come to work, there isn't a machine that deletes that. So that feeds into the institutional bias, those things that are baked in. So to your question, part of how we dismantle this is to really insist on our leaders taking a look at how do they either perpetuate or uphold these institutional biases, such as the policies, the hiring practices, the promotional practices. How do they uphold this? And how can they dismantle it? Because it's these leaders at that level, CEO, executive team, those director levels, managers, and I would say even down to frontline supervisors, they are really the ones who are in a position to either uphold or dismantle these institutionalized or baked in policies and procedures. One of the exciting things that I'm doing with corporations today to disrupt institutionalized promotion and especially when it comes to leadership pipeline, I do a lot of work on multicultural talent development. So I've developed six very powerful modules. We take a cohort from the company to go through this. And by the time that they go through it and their leaders go through it as well, they are really in a position to be part of the leadership pipeline. Because if we're going to wait at the snail pace, wait for multicultural talent and diverse talent to go up to the pipeline, we'll be here forever. We'll be long and dead. So to disrupt it, we have to identify those talents. We have to give them the resources. We have to give them the development opportunities and really put them in line in the leadership pipeline.
Oh, that is powerful, Sonia. And thank you for bringing that real example of what corporations are doing to accelerate the pipeline towards leadership. You know, for many years, for decades, we have been talking about diversifying the C-suite level, yet is through actions and examples like the one that you mentioned that we can start moving the needle in certain areas of the organization. Sonia, can you share with our audience what else do you have coming up? I know that you are speaking at some major corporate conventions and conferences. Please share with us more about the exciting work that you are doing in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much for the question. So I have the privilege to serve a range of corporations and organizations. And the work that I am currently doing for a number of corporations is this multicultural talent development, taking various cohorts through some very empowering transformational pieces to get them ready for the leadership pipeline. I also speak at a lot of conferences like you, my dear friend. So coming up very shortly is the Big SHRM annual conference in New Orleans. I am also speaking at a few other conferences that's coming up. I'm speaking to the petroleum community, and so I do quite a bit of work in diversity, equity, inclusion with leaders as well as frontline employees. And I look forward to seeing you in New Orleans.
Yes, that's going to be a powerful convention. So I'm looking forward to present. Both of us are presenting 2 sessions each. So stay tuned. Find more information on their website, SHRM22, and sign up to attend. That's going to be an epic conference. So Sonia, I have 2 more questions for you, my friend. And many of our audience members are in fact DEI practitioners. And Sonia, you know, I get emails and calls about the challenges they are currently facing. This is a field that is non-stop. It is non-stop, and I don't believe will stop anytime soon. So if you have the power to see the future, you know, and what would you say are those challenges that DEI leaders will face in the future?
Wonderful question. And the answer is in the question, which is that it's unknown, right? If you think about where we are today, you know, 3 years ago, who would have predicted this pandemic? Who would have imagined this hybrid workplace culture? Who would have imagined how pronounced the inequitable situations are in the way we work, access to technology, and so on? So I would say that for my fellow practitioners like yourself, like those who are listening to this podcast, cultivate learning to find comfort in the discomfort. Find comfort in the discomfort. Cultivate learning how to be at peace in uncertainty. I would say cultivate humility in the midst of the unknown. So when you think about those who've done very well during this pandemic, it's those who found comfort in the discomfort. It's those who learned to be calm in the face of uncertainty. It's those who humble themselves to say, I will learn, I will adapt, I will flex, because that is our future. Our future is uncertain, but we ourselves can find ways to be calm in the midst of uncertainty.
Ah, that is comfort during the discomfort, Sonia. That is a quote that I believe all of us should print and place somewhere in our office or in our house to get to remember to maintain peace during times that challenge our own very core. So, Sonia, to close, I always ask all my guests to share their favorite quotes and why that's their favorite quote. So please, do you mind sharing with our audience what's your favorite quote and why?
My dear friend, you and I have these wonderful conversations and we share quotes with one another all the time. And I know this is one of your signature questions, and I thought about it. And my favorite are really questions. They're the last two lines in a poem that I love that's written by the poet Mary Oliver. She has a poem called The Summer Day. And at the very end, she asks two questions, and it's my favorite quote because these are questions that I ask myself on a regular basis. She says, doesn't everything die at last and too soon? So tell me, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild, precious life? So these two questions, my friend, are my favorite because they're really about purpose and intention. And it's something that we need to ask ourselves every day because every day is different. Life is like a roller coaster. This business is like a roller coaster. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, sometimes you're sideways. And life is like that. It will knock you around. But you always have to remind yourself of your purpose. You have to remind yourself of your intention. And that's why I love this quote so much, because it reminds me we're born and we die. Life is brief. So what will you do with your one wild, precious life? Make sure that it has purpose. Make sure it has intention.
Sonia, and that is the motto of Inclusive Heroes. We live with intention, we live with passion, we live with purpose, and constantly challenge ourselves to live up to that expectation. Sonia, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your stories, your legacy, you are a legend in this field. So thank you for sharing all of that with our audience. And I know we have a few surprises that we will share with the world as we continue to go on 2022. Sonia, anything else you want to share with our people before we close?
Thank you so much for your leadership, my dear friend. Thank you to everyone who are listening. And I just want to say the pleasure was mine. All the best.
Thank you. And to you all, thank you for tuning in. Please follow Sonia on LinkedIn, connect with her. She puts amazing content, and stay tuned because there are at least 3 more episodes coming to you before we finish season number 1 of the Inclusive Heroes podcast. Thank you, everybody, and make it a great, great week.